Okay, so I hope we are live now. I'll just check on the FB. Uh, okay, so we are live. Just a minute. And this is full screen. Okay, topic. Just a minute. 1 minute to go. Okay, I just checked with Hital whether we are live or not, right? And then we start.
Yeah.
उधर बाजू में लाइव कमेंट में आ गया मैसेज कुछ तो गुड इवनिंग
आ
अनिल
गया?
सर एंड पैनलिस्ट
Okay,
फेसबुक
right?
यूजर
Good.
So we are good to go. Yeah. Okay. So good evening, everyone, and today we are starting our discussion on anesthesia in morbidly obese patients, and we have a very like luminary panel here. We are starting with Dr. Hemant Shinde sir. Everybody knows him, and sir is from Bombay. Dr. Aparna Sinha and Dr. Lakshmi from Max Hospital, Delhi. Dr. Namrata from Asia Columbia Hospital in Calcutta, and our own Dr. Ankit, a very budding anesthetist from Apollo Ahmedabad. So, though it's a very big topic, but we'll cut the flap because that's what it's all about. We have to like operate on morbidly obese patients, and obesity, as we all know, is a new epidemic. It's a lifestyle disease, and we do encounter all sort of patients, obese patients, if not for bariatric surgery, so maybe for non-bariatric surgeries also. So our audience today is from DNB first year to senior consultants who are practicing in various setups and have various degrees of skills. So I want that at the end of this discussion they are able to like handle patients better because of all the experience inputs they will get from our experts, right? So may I start from Dr. Ankit? So Dr. Ankit will give you a background of like obesity and all that, so that we can go into the clinical discussion later. So as we all know that the incidence of obesity is around 20 to 30%, and it's a real challenge for anesthesiologists when we get such obese patients in our setups. So this was one such patient in our setup. She is 82 BMI, 266 kg. So I hope that after the end of this discussion, many of our audience members from the audience will be able to handle such patients. So Dr. Ankit, just please a brief background of all the things, please. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Anil. So, as Dr. Anil has rightly mentioned, that prevalence of obesity is increasing day by day. And by definition, if we see the obesity is more than 20% of ideal body weight, if you take an account of height, age, and sex of the patient. And it is not only a lifestyle disease, but it is now becoming a metabolic disease as well, because so many factors and things are associated with obesity. Like it affects every system of the body, like cardiovascular system, it affects the GI system, CNS. It can develop a patient can develop intracranial hypertension. Some of the cancers are associated with obesity. So overall, obesity is not a lifestyle disease or a disease of a higher class. It becomes a much more a metabolic disease. And if you see, there are a lot of classification of obesity are available with us. One such is with BMI, which is the most commonly used classification. And as the BMI goes up, the patient is classified like obese, morbidly obese, or super obese. And the other classification is given by WHO. And if you see that different weights are there to predict the ideal body weight and lean body weight, which will ultimately help us to and later on decide the drug formulas for the total body weight or ideal body weight candidates. We can start with the things like the topic assigned to me is like pre-operative assessment and how to go about the obese patient. So obese patients are like offered the treatment only when they are having a BMI of 40 or more than 40 without comorbidities, and with 35 of BMI with comorbidities. Surgical management is only long-term effective solutions for all these patients. And surgery is offered when the BMI is, as I mentioned, 40 or more than 35 with comorbidities. Patient has been on restricted diet for more than 1 year but not losing the weight. Obesity itself is prolonged for 5 years, and patient understand all of the risk of the operation and surgery and anesthesia. And there is an acceptable patient, and it has got a lot of benefits. As you can see, cardiovascular mortalities come down. Hypertension, if there is a previously associated, that can go down, or patient can go on lower medicines. There is a resolution of diabetes type 2 in majority of patients. Dyslipidemia is corrected and everything. But if you go for this patient, we have to scale those patients, like we have to tell them that they are not with the risk. So one such risk scale is obesity mortality scoring system. If we get
पता नहीं बॉस यार तो फैन का ही होगा मैं देख रहा हूँ
a patient with mortality of up to 0.4%. So that these patients are not at a lower risk than the general population. Their patient more risk, more chances of having morbidity or mortality throughout the surgery. So when to if you approach a patient who is an obese, like a patient coming to your OPD for pre-op assessment for, let's say, a Roux-en-Y bariatric surgery, surgeon has sent the patient. So in each and every patient has to be assessed individually with a detailed
hello
Hi, yes.
yeah so is it audible to all is there any sound issue or something like that
There was some disturbance coming.
Disturbance was coming.
yeah I think now it has been sorted out I think there must be some problem with the networking and all that right Dr. Hemant, I'm coming to you, sir. What is one thing like the patient comes to you for an obese surgery? Like, what are the things what you have in your PAC setup, in your PAC clinic? Like, what is the basic that you want to see and you want to optimize?
Okay, so whenever these patients come, thankfully our surgeons are smart now. They refer to these cases much earlier than what used to be in the past. And since my first and the foremost thing would be to all the people who are listening is you do the PAC yourself and you do it well in advance. That is another thing. You can't just do it at the, say, on the table or one day prior, tomorrow's the case and patient is admitted. I believe it should be done well in advance. That's the take home message number one, that do your PAC well in advance. That's one. Of course, all the confidence building measures and all that stuff will happen. There have been instances where your PAC can go on for hours because these people come with huge files. They've got lots and lots of opinions, second opinion, investigation, and stuff like that has been done. So you have to go through it. They are on lot of other medicines and stuff like that. So you have to go through it. Then the cross references, you have to go through it. So all that when you are done, then the concerns come to your mind that, okay, the chief thing that always comes to my mind is when I see an obese patient, whether he is or she coming in for a bariatric surgery or a non-bariatric operation, how am I going to use the airway? Will I be able to ventilate the patient? Will I be able to intubate this patient? This is what primarily comes to my mind. So we always look at the airway as our primary thing which comes to our mind. But besides airway, of course, there are so many other things also. Of course, that will be dealt with by my colleagues. But about the airway, of course, so if you ask me what I'm most worried about, whether I'll be able to ventilate, whether I'll be intubating this patient, what is my going to be my plan A, how am I going to do it, and of course the all the other comorbidities which I want to the cardiovascular system, whether the patient has got high blood pressure, what are the ischemias, the ECG investigation. So basically I would request all of you that it needs to be you have to have a what you all systemic view of this particular patient, whether it is cardiovascular, what is the effort tolerance, what kind of surgery we are going to do, how much time it's going to take, whether blood losses will happen or no. So the approach has to be what you say a comprehensive approach with multi-pronged system wise. You have to go a structured approach, I would like to say. And of course the biggest problem with obesity is obstructive sleep apnea. Believe me, 70% of the patients do have it, but many of them are not diagnosed. So that is another headache for an anesthesiologist when we are doing such cases. So your approach
Right.
has to be a comprehensive, well in advance you have to do it, a multi-pronged one, a structured one, and that is what I would say in a nutshell. Of course, I won't go in the detail because Ankit is going to take the details.
Dr. Aparna, coming to you, ma'am, that you are handling a lot of bariatric cases and exclusively bariatric like. So, what is the protocol at your center? Like, are the patients directly referred to you from the OPD of the surgeon, or what is the protocol and how do you go about it, ma'am?
Yeah, so thank you, Anil, for it's a very pertinent question, and as rightly explained by Dr. Hemant, that we need to have a very institutional protocol, and we have to approach every system. So I should have an image in my on my mind as to how I'm going to approach. I have to definitely evaluate every system, because it's a very multi-system disorder. Obesity will affect every system of the patient, and of course it will affect the airway as well. So coming to the pre-op assessment, one thing we have to be very cautious about, give a glance to the general persona of the patient. What is the energy level of the patient? So in most of the cases, when it's a long-standing obesity, it's a chronic condition, we find that the energy level is less. Patient, sometimes there are some patients who even while talking to you may fall asleep, and there will be an attendant who will be giving history on their behalf. So these sort of patients have to be red flagged. So we should be able to pick up in our pre-op assessment what are the factors on which my focus during pre-op optimization is going to be. So we have definitely involved our surgeons also. So surgeons are now quite familiar, as rightly pointed out by Anil also, that they have become smarter, they are very cooperative, and we have told them that which are the patients who definitely need to be seen by an anesthesiologist much in advance. So a patient, for example, with a large neck, so the nurse who's the attendant who's waiting outside the surgeon's OPD, surgeon might not be in the immediate vicinity of an anesthesiologist. So surgeon has to be aware which are the patients who can create major problem for the anesthesiologist and for the post-operative outcomes. So nurse should be able to take the neck circumference while the patient is waiting. She will prepare a chart for the surgeon where she will, note down things like BMI, neck circumference, what are the vitals of the patient, what is the baseline SpO2 of the patient. So when the patient goes into the surgeon's room, in one corner of the surgeon's prescription, there will be some factors written. So immediately the surgeon will see, okay, the saturation is less than 95%. Oh, the neck is more than 40. Oh, the vitals are not maintained. These are the patients who definitely need to be seen by the anesthesiologist by pre-op aggressive assessment and optimization. So we
madam, in
definitely
your
have institutional protocols.
yes, ma'am.
Yes.
And in your practice, I think you must have encountered many patients who will definitely come and say that I have been on CPAP for so long, or I have been using BiPAP in night. What is the incidence of OSA and how do you optimize an OSA patient, madam?
Yeah, so okay, it's a very long question. So in two parts. One is the patients who we find out during our pre-op assessment on basis of clinical scoring systems. And second is the patient who's already coming with a diagnosis who is saying that I'm on CPAP. Now, so a patient who's saying that I'm on CPAP, probably some physician has definitely diagnosed some element of sleep disordered breathing or obstructive sleep apnea for the patient. So this patient needs to be also assessed because we don't know how compliant the patient is with CPAP. So that patient also needs to be assessed. So that patient we will try to assess that whether the patient is compliant with
Hello?
CPAP or not, depending on the
Hello?
clinical scoring system. Because not every center will have
Okay.
access to sleep studies. So stop bank score is one such score which has become extremely popular with the physicians, with the surgeons, with the anesthesiologists. Even the nurses have started learning to do how to perform the score. So each score, it is a 8 score system where we have to sort of a stage will come if I can be shown that slide where I have shown that our PSC form itself should have parameters which will show that these are the important parameters. So amongst the stop band scores also the neck circumference is very important. Okay, BMI is very important. Although the original scoring they said that any score 0, 1 and 2 will be mild, 3, 4 and 5 will be moderate, and anything 6 and above will be a severe sleep apnea. And this stop bank score has been shown to have very close relation with even the sleep studies. All right. But amongst the score, even if the score is 0 to 2, for example, 0, 1 and 2, if one of the factors is neck circumference, if one of the factors is BMI, then also we should take this as a severe sleep apnea. So even the stop bank scoring system has been remodified. So it is also suggested from the original researchers that you include SpO2 in that, you include ABG parameters in that, okay, you include SpO2 and you include bicarb levels in that. Okay, so then it will give us a sort of approximation as to how long standing, supposing bicarb levels are 28 and above, we know it is a long standing case. Okay, so we actually, on the basis of stop bank score, we first need to categorize the patient, whether it is mild, moderate, and severe. If the neck circumference is high, BMI is, let's say, more than 50 and above, this should be taken as a high sleep apnea, even if high stop bank score, even if the score might be 0, 1, and 2. So we don't rigidly stick to that classification. We take our clinical judgment in deciding, which type of patient it is. And if this, even if the stop bank scoring is, let us say, less than 3, but if the SpO2 of the patient is, let us say, less than 95 or less than 94. Now, these are the patients on whom I will sort of aggressively investigate. I might like to do an arterial blood gas for the patient. Because why? What am I trying to find out? I am trying to find out which are the patients whose post-operative outcome is likely to be very, very adverse. Which are the patients for whom I need to definitely prepare my post-operative care. So it is not just about choice of patient, it is also about intra-op care and post-operative care. So if there is a patient who's showing, for example, daytime hypercapnia, patient is coming to me, I get suspicious, I request the patient to go and get the arterial blood gas. Patient comes back to me, I see a PCO2 of more than 45. So this is a patient who's probably going towards obesity hypoventilation. Now these are the patients who are like absolute no for a planned surgery. Okay, so these are the patients who I will definitely aggressively prepare. I will definitely put the patient on auto CPAP. Not all patients need to go and meet the sleep apnea specialist. We can definitely have an alliance with the companies who offer the CPAP machines, the BiPAP machines on rent. They are easily available. We can tell the patient to be put on an auto CPAP mode or an auto BiPAP mode. Okay, and I call the patient, let us say after a week or after 10 days, I see that there is symptomatic improvement in the patient. I repeat an ABG. I see that there is a significant improvement in the patient. It shows us two things. One, patient is responding. Second, patient is not non-compliant. Because a non-compliant patient is definitely going to trouble us later. So just putting the patient on CPAP is nothing. Okay, so we need to again, we need to sort of counsel the patient. We need to counsel the attendants.
So the gist of the thing, as we understand, is that the more you work hard for the patient pre-op, the better the outcome in the post-op.
Absolutely. Because if we accept a patient, we see that, oh, the patient is on CPAP, this patient is fine. I have put the patient on CPAP machine for 10 days. So he's fine. No, I need to reassess. Now here you can see that, there was this large study that was done on more than 1 lakh patient, and the study was conducted over 4 years. It is a multi-center study, and they studied the post-operative outcomes. They found that every outcome, be it cardiovascular, be hypoxemic episodes, be it re-intubation, we found that everything was much higher in patients with sleep disordered breathing. Okay, so sleep disordered breathing are the patients who definitely need a major hard work on the part of the anesthesiologist, the entire team, and even the attendants. The attendants have to be motivated. We have to make sure that we involve them in care of the patient. They are the ones who will ultimately be looking after the patient when the patient is discharged. There's a good number of patients who, if not properly optimized, we find that everything was fine, the saturation did not drop, patient was maintaining everything, and we send the patient back home after the surgery. So there is a high incidence of patients who report up to 1 week after discharge to the casualty with respiratory distress. Now, why does that happen? Because somewhere we failed to tell the importance of continuing the non-invasive ventilation till the patient has had some amount of weight loss. Because once the weight loss starts happening, patient will himself start getting a sense of well-being. Okay, and of course, patient will have access to a portable pulse oximeter, for example. That is a very affordable thing. We can educate the patient. Now, here you can see we have included the stop bank score right in the PAC form. Now, even the surgeons have started. So here you will see that neck circumference should be now a routine while we are doing pre-op assessment. So it is not just about bariatric surgery. It is definitely about non-bariatric surgery as well, because patient is coming for a lap chole. Patient may not be willing to wait for a long time. So if I see that the neck circumference is high, BMI is high, then the patient will have to definitely be warned that no, we cannot accept you right now. BMI is, let's say, in the range of 30s, neck circumference is not very high, room air SpO2 is more than 95, then maybe we can think of taking the patient much earlier than 2 weeks. So every case has to be reassessed, so every patient is not the same. So we need to check on every patient.
Right.
We have to customize our care. Yes.
It is about the perioperative risk reduction. Basically, that is important. So if the risk reduction strategy has been put rightly in the minds of people, in the minds of patient, in the minds of surgeon, I think so the outcome is always the best. So this is
always the best, and even we have to involve the family of the patient.
Right, madam.
The patient family also needs to be shown. We need to show them that, look, the patient is sleeping and look how much is the SpO2 dripping. So this cannot be allowed unattended when the patient is discharged. So we have to educate the family also. Definitely.
So coming to Dr. Namrata. Dr. Namrata, do you like to add something in your protocol of the PACs, what you have heard from Dr. Hemant and Aparna madam?
I think Aparna has covered more or less very well the OSA system and all. She's covered very well. So basically, if we involve the family, which we usually do, involve the family and the surgeon, like Hemant has said, then it is fine. And the PAC form itself should integrate everything, like Aparna has said. You should have the systems, which we also have. The scoring system of OSA and the grading all should be there in the PSC form itself, so that we don't forget any points and we don't miss any point. That is it. We also have the same protocol as Aparna, so that's absolutely
Right, madam. Thank you.
One thing I
So-
just wanted to say, sir, Dr.
Yeah.
Anil, many
Yeah,
patients come and say that they are using CPAP and BiPAP. But when you
Yeah.
actually, ask them, there might be a leak and they say it is tight and they remove it in the night. So we cannot just go by the thing that the patient is already on CPAP pre-op. Okay, so we have to thoroughly investigate him again as if he's not using. And nowadays, the SIM card from the machine can be taken and studied. So in that we can actually know how many hours the patient has used his CPAP, or he just said he uses it for 8 hours and has hardly used it for half an hour. So that is again another important thing. We all have to be, suspicious from that angle too.
Right, madam.
Absolutely, yeah.
See, what is the perception in every anesthetist mind is that, obesity means difficult intubation. How difficult it is actually. I think by the possibility of it being difficult, the preparations are so much that if we fail to plan, we plan to fail. That is the thing. So, Dr. Namrata, how do you assess an airway, and what are the things you look for an airway in an obese patient once you decide that, okay, this is the patient for the surgery?
For airway assessment, we start with like normal airway assessment, what we do in this thing, but we have to take a inch tape with us, so that we can accurately measure the neck circumference and the distance from the mental to the hyoid bones. The mouth opening can be accurately measured, because even 1 inch here and there makes a lot of difference when you're taking up the patient to the for the OT. And how you measuring a certain distance is also matters. For example, let's take the mental thyroid distance. So what we are doing is, like, ask the patient to extend the neck and then take from the mental to the higher distance. So you have to be very careful when you are doing the Malampati test. Ask the patient to sit absolutely straight, so that his face is facing absolutely forward to you, and then ask to open the mouth and then assess. As it is, the tongue is very large volume and it is very difficult for you to see what's happening. You have to keep your eye level at the level of the patient. So these things have to be kept very carefully managed. And as I said, in the PSC form itself, have these distances written together, so that when you're taking up the patient, you know that if the neck circumference is more than 40, you know definitely that it will be a difficult intubation. And the thing about intubation is that we make so much of this thing about intubation. It is not difficult intubation, it is difficult ventilation. So basically, what we face once the patient has been well positioned and we have put it in the patient in the RAM position, we have put the patient. Can we show the RAM position so that we can take it from there onwards to the. And just before that, see, this is the ramp position which we can see. Once we have put the patient in this ramp position, like we have all the pillows. Where is the sound coming from? There's a background sound. Can you please mute? Rest of you, if you
I
mute.
think those speakers who are not speaking can mute, please, if that is the thing. I think
Ankit, can you please?
Is there any
Yeah,
fan going in the background? That is what I feel, something like that.
Yeah, now I think this is better.
This
So
is better.
if we can see if we put the pillows and we ramp up the position. If we don't have the ramping pillow itself, we can just put the different pillows. Like this photograph particularly shows it very well. And you have this patient with extended neck with the external meatus in the level of the sternal notch. But then we have this position. If we put it in this position, the patient doesn't have usually any intubation difficulty. What happens is patient has lot of buccal fats. There is lot of pharyngeal fat. So it is very difficult to ventilate these patients when you are giving pre-oxygenating the patient and once the muscle relaxant has been given. We have to assess the patient whether we can ventilate the patient well. So as soon as you give any sedation First and foremost, we have to do the pre-oxygenation very well. We have to pre-oxygenate the patient for at least 5 minutes to 10 minutes before that, so that the oxygen saturation is maintained for at least 4 minutes above 95 to 96 SpO2. Only then try to induce the patient, and then after you have induced the patient, then ventilate the patient and see whether it can be ventilated properly. So hold the mask properly, see whether the patient can be ventilated. If not, if you cannot ventilate, try to put it in a LMA and see whether the patient can be ventilated properly. Only then go for a muscle relaxant so that you can give. Assess the patient beforehand. If there is, the mouth opening is very restricted, then plan beforehand to do a awake intubation, awake fiber optic intubation. In these cases, for intubation, it is very, very necessary to have plan A, B, C, D all planned together before you even think of taking the patient in the OT. So before the patient is taken in the OT, you have plan A, B, C, D, you have the intubation trolley ready, you have well labeled drawers, in which I think I had given one intubation trolley slide in which there was, in which you have the one before, I think. You have well labeled drawers. Okay, so the first one will have just your plain intubation, like you have your either video laryngoscopy or plain laryngoscopy, whatever you are comfortable with, Mac blade or whatever you're comfortable with, that is the A. Then second one, you have the second rescue one. So if you cannot ventilate, then you put in the LMA. So the second will have well labeled ProSeal masks and other LMA masks, so that they are well labeled. So you don't have to think that time that, okay, where is it and how you ask your label. No, you yourself have to see all the trolley where it is well labeled, so that you find the things where it is there. The last one, always ask your surgeon to be present in the OT when you are intubating. In case you cannot intubate, you have to go for thyroidectomy or thyroidectomy, then you'll have to, picothyroidectomy, you have to have the surgeon there. You cannot then put in the needle, you will not be able to find things. Have the ultrasound ready so that you can locate where the membrane is, where you'll have to puncture. Have all these ready, marked before you take up the patient for intubation or ventilation, so that there is no sudden panic in the OT, and in these cases, panic, you'll simply lose the patient. So basically, you have to plan well before.
I will
you
like
also
to
have to have a perimeter.
Yeah, Dr. Lakshmi here. Dr. Lakshmi, ma'am. Yeah.
Something I wanted to add for what Namrata has already said. One thing is, in this COVID era, every patient comes with a mask. So airway assessment, becomes even more tougher. So in our institution, what we are doing is, patient has been instructed to take a selfie with his mouth open and send us a WhatsApp. Or if it's a video consultation of PAC, then, then it's easy to assess the airway. That is one thing which we are doing now. Second thing is, when, as Dr. Namrata said, pre-oxygenation for a long time. In this, one of the endpoints with the modern, machines is the end tidal oxygen more than 90%. So earlier we used to say vital capacity breaths, tidal volume breaths, SpO2. So now the latest thing in addition to that is going to be the end tidal oxygen, because most of our machines, nowadays have the provision of this. So this is an added advantage that we have in this era.
Yeah, this is a very good point Lakshmi has put out in this COVID era to do the. Aparna, you want to say something?
Yes, one more thing I want to add in addition to all this is, in patients who we find that, the landmarks are not well defined.
Yeah.
And in patients where we find that the mask ventilation is going to be really difficult. So, if you have ultrasound, it's better to put a mark with thyroid right in the beginning. Before you start.
That is exactly what I said, that you have the ultrasound machine and mark it before you take up the patient.
Before you take the patient.
A very, very practical question to all the panelists, and I think this question is always in the minds of those people who are not.
Anil, one more thing which I wanted to say is that in pre-oxygenation, in these kind of patient, it is easier to do it with nasopharyngeal airway than with oropharyngeal airway.
Yes,
that makes up. You always have all sizes of nasopharyngeal airway and also have a catheter or bougie which has an oxygen, this thing like entry catheter or something, which will help you pre-oxygenate the patient while you are ventilating or while you are intubating the patient also. So nasopharyngeal airways are very, very useful there.
Right.
Anil, can I add something there? Anil?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to know from the panelists, like how many times you have actually faced a difficult intubation in an obese patient, because this question is always there that I may encounter, but how many times you have actually encountered and what was your rescue plan in
Okay.
practicality?
One thing, I mean, maybe Namrata should answer first, and then we all
Yeah,
can.
let Namrata talk.
We are all experienced.
See, basically, we have anticipated difficult intubation beforehand. So we go for fiber optic in cases where we anticipate difficult intubation. So basically, I've never had a difficult intubation on table. So what I do is anticipate and do it beforehand so that we can go for fiber optic. If not, then before we have all these plans before we take up the patient for the
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So, Anil, what I would like to add over here is that, you know, when we look at the studies, you know, I was in detail studying about different airway management studies that have been published from different centers. So what they have, some studies have said that, you know, any BMI more than 26, I find it difficult. Some have said, quoted some figures. So what is lacking in those studies is that most of them are not mentioning what was the position of the patient at the time of intubation. So if your patient is positioned on the ramp, if your patient is positioned in such a way that the tragus and the manubrium are at the same level, and if you are prepared, if you have your nasopharyngeal airway in place, then laryngoscopy and intubation definitely is not difficult in most cases.
Actually, I have faced difficult ventilation.
Whatever is
quite a number of times. I have faced difficult ventilation holding up the jaw quite a number of times.
Laryngoscopy may be a problem. Laryngoscopy may be a problem because of large tongue, or, you know.
And even the breast has, actually positioning is the main thing. Even the removal of the breast away from when you are intubating, all these small procedures make a lot of difference when you are intubating the patient.
Training all the staff that is assisting you. They have to know, at times they have to come and elevate the jaw for you because your hands are occupied. You know, if a patient is really having a lot of fat here, then, you know, there are these short hand blades handles available. So
Yeah,
they
I
do
will
not
like to take your point, madam, here about the large breast. I will like to show this pic, and I will like to show this. Can you see this micropore thing? This is attached to the breast, and this is like covering the breast, and then this is stretching it, right? So this is what we need to do when we are
in the other direction. In the other direction for laryngoscopy.
Yeah, so this is a very practical point. The whole thing was that in my practice, I have never encountered a difficult intubation as such. So I wanted to know from various experts at various centers. What we basically do is a two-man ventilation strategy. So how many setups we have a backup anesthetist? That is what I wanted to know. Do you routinely?
Always. In bariatric, always you have. And one more thing which I missed was the height of the table. You have to keep the height of the table well because the patient is obese. The height really comes up. So you'll have to keep the table down so that you are able to either see the proper size. So before you take up the patient, just adjust the height of the table so that you can intubate the patient properly. That is one more very important thing.
One more thing I wanted to add here.
You wanted to add something?
Let me go.
Yeah, so that, you know, one thing we recently discovered, or rather found out, was that Portex nasopharyngeal airway is actually got a little more length than the usual nasopharyngeal airways.
The longer than the Romson's one.
Sorry, Romson's,
No, you are saying right. The Portex is longer than the Romson's
one. That's what I mean. So we can, that is one. And second thing is, you know, there are some patients, of course, we have not seen, but, you know, if you read the literature, it is there, that in spite of such a long pre-oxygenation, also the ETO2 doesn't go up. Then what do you do? So for that, nowadays Thrive is available.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add. Yeah, Lakshmi. That's what.
I've never used Thrive though. I've never. Hemant, have you used Thrive in OT?
No. I'll tell you what.
But you can use high flow
Yeah.
of the.
What we do
No, that
normally
is
is
70 liters per minute. You know,
in the ramp position. If you have oxygenated the patient, and as Lakshmi nicely said, end-tidal oxygen up to 90. That's one. There are people who also go by time, that they kind of 6 liters or 8 liters of flow, and then they will ventilate for 4 minutes. That's because your time constants of around 4 minutes. That's another way of doing it. Thirdly, what you can do nicely is attach a normal nasal cannula if you don't have high flow nasal oxygen.
Yes,
Start at 6 liters. You are in the ramp position. Beyond 6, don't go, because the dry gases that are going through the nasopharynx irritates the patient. It causes some amount of pain. So what you do, you are nicely ventilating the patient with a tight face mask, and the nasal cannula is going on with 6 liters. The moment your propofol goes in and patient passes off, then you can increase the flow
Increase
to
the flow.
15 liters per minute, and that is what maximum you will get on your normal nasal cannula, not the high flow nasal oxygen. I have used high flow nasal oxygen on myself only in a conference on the stalls. How does it feel? And believe me, I was extremely skeptical when somebody told me it gives 60 liters of flow, and I was worried that it would cause dryness of my nasal mucosa, but it doesn't. It is extremely comfortable. You don't even come to know that you have put yourself onto a 60 liters of oxygen that is being rushed through your nasopharynx.
Hemant, can I add? When you were saying that after propofol gave high range of nasal, instead of that, just after this thing, I have put in a fine nasopharyngeal catheter.
Yeah,
And
you
that
said
also
nine-
takes care of
nine-
the,
yeah,
that,
yeah,
is-
but
that
correct,
adds to the oxygenation.
correct.
yes.
That's-
Just
that's
after
what you
propofol, you can
mentioned.
put in the nasopharyngeal, so it works.
Yeah, so nasopharyngeal catheter, and a tight fitting mask, a nasal cannula, and if you have HFNO, go for it. It's very comfortable, because I have used it on myself, and I've
Yes.
experienced it. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful.
Right. Ma'am, coming to
Relax.
Dr. Lakshmi, madam. Dr. Lakshmi, what is the routine monitoring that you put on your patients? What are the routine monitors that you put on your
Right.
patients
yeah.
for bariatric surgery?
You know, exactly. So, you know, when we were studying, you know, it was told that morbid obese means all invasive lines, and, you know, so, but now, you know, things have changed. So, the routine monitoring, as we are using for any other patient, and only thing in these patients, the one problem which we can have is a ill-fitting blood pressure cuff. The arm circumference may be so high that our BP cuff may not be, you know, encircling the arm also, or when it inflates, you know, it just opens up. So in these patients, even a forearm blood pressure cuff should be fine, you know. So that is one thing which has come up now. Now, rest of the monitoring, of course, as you know, pulse oximetry and SpO2, all that, of course, we are going to do, no doubt about that. Now, another thing which, you know, invasive monitorings. So, where do we use invasive arterial monitoring? So, this is now again, I said, not a routine in morbidly obese patients. If we can measure the proper blood pressure either in the arm or in the forearm. Now, in those patients, you know, where we have to do frequent blood gas analysis, say a patient of obesity hypoventilation syndrome comes to you, say for an emergency surgery, or when you expect more fluid shifts, etc., or you want frequent ABGs to be done post-operatively because the patient is really non-compliant with the BiPAP or CPAP, those patients, yes, you may have to do an invasive arterial. The other group is when the patient has a nephropathy, or when the patient has a cardiovascular low ejection fractions. So we put in an invasive line and monitor the cardiac output through that. You know, stroke volume variation, all that can be monitored through this arterial line itself. So it's a kind of, you know, you don't have to go in for those pulmonary artery catheters and all. So with this itself, we can go for that. So that is one indication for the arterial. Now, as IV lines, as you know, we always put in 2 IV lines, and you don't, as I said, not need a CVP at all for these patients. A peripherally inserted central line is good enough. And now with the help of the ultrasound machines, it has become very easy to put in a peripherally inserted central line. Then another monitor which we don't use normally, but which is going to be helpful in these patients, though there are too many controversial views, too many pros and cons, is the bispectral index monitor. Now, if you're using TIVA or whatever, now bispectral, it gives you the depth of anesthesia and gives you the time at which you can reverse the anesthesia. So it gives you a fairly good idea. So a person who is beginning his career, if he starts using his BIS monitors, he'll get a fairly good idea as to when to titrate, how to reduce the inhalationals or reduce the IV agents, etc. So that is one good thing. Though with ketamine and all, there are a lot of variations. Agreed. Now, what other monitor? These are the few monitors. I think.
Yeah, actually, madam is right. They rarely require invasive monitoring, but I have put a pic of this patient where actually it was required because this lady had very difficult IV cannulation and being 260 plus kg. So we have to put a central line as we didn't have any IV cannulation for that matter. And like rightly pointed out by madam that if you have a good BP cuff, you don't require invasive arterial line, but again then we had to go. We have to choose our patients accordingly, and if required, we have to go for central line just for the purpose of securing an IV. Basically, it is not for monitoring purpose.
Somebody is asking about how to put in a venous access and how easy it is, and
Yeah.
they are also asking peripheral inserted central line means Cavafix or not. These are the two questions which is
we will take the
It
question
can
at the
mean.
end of it. Yeah, it is a Cavafix only, a sort of Cavafix.
So there's shorter Cavafix also available, they are just
Yeah.
about 12 centimeters or 18 centimeters.
So basically, a good IV is a must, and before you start. So coming to the induction part, like what is the choice of a muscle relaxant for intubation? Dr. Hemant, can I come to you, sir?
Oh yes. See, I like to use. I don't use succinylcholine for years now, but if I really find that it's going to be a big issue with intubation, then I may choose. But thankfully, in last 10-12 years at least, I have not used Sux ever. Having said that, yes, I don't totally bypass it. I keep it ready on the trolley, but I don't withdraw it. And the second thing, of course, I use is whatever is available in those places wherever I'm attached to. I've done intubations on ROC, I've done intubations on Cisetra as well as Etra. So I don't have a great choice of particular drug as such. But these are the ones which I normally use, either a ROC or a Cis or a Etra, whatever, either of these three, depending upon the patient's other parameters, cardiac involvement, respiratory problems, COPDs, and all. Obviously, then ROC would find a good place.
So Ankit, do you have
One thing, Dr. Anil. Yeah, I just wanted to say, Dr. Hemant, I just want, because it's a postgraduate session also, we have to make it very clear that for any emergency surgeries or redo bariatrics which come, we have to use succinylcholine in these patients. Okay, of course, Norpironium is available, but I think we still prefer succinylcholine in these patients. So at least for the PG students, I think this is the message we have to send across.
No, plus even in COVID area, I think recently I started using choline quite a lot. So succinylcholine has been used for last
or maybe you can pre-curarize and use a non-depolarizing also.
So what we do at our hospital is like we use Cisatracurium or Atracurium depending. Previously we used to use Atracurium, now we are using Cisatracurium. And if there is an anticipated difficult intubation, then surely use a sulfametonium with a pre-curarization of Atracurium with a small dose of Atracurium or Cisatracurium. That is what we do at Apollo.
So
Ankit, I think Ankit is just on audio, I guess.
Yeah, no, Ankit is actually some problem with his setup. I think he's on mobile with us.
Just audio will do. Yeah, just
But I
audio.
can see him.
Yeah.
That's a fixed.
Coming to Dr. Hemant, sir. Sir, what are your pre-oxidation like? CPAP is there. Like, how do you go about it?
Before I go there, there's a question who's directly asked to me when you said 6 liters oxygen with nasal cannula and mask ventilation in ramp. Did you mean you don't bag mask with oxygen? No, 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 no. This we will answer probably at the end of it. So
I
what
think,
I meant
Hemant,
is-
you answer this now, because the
Okay,
ones which
okay.
are directly questions are asked, then it is easier to cover it now. Than
Okay, fair enough. So I will answer it. See, when I say 6 liters of oxygen and the nasal cannula, what I mean is I am going to ventilate the patient. Patient is fasting. I don't have an issue with regurgitation. I'm going to ventilate him nicely. But in addition to that, this is apneic oxygenation. That is what we are dealing with. So high flow nasal cannula exactly does that. But suppose you don't have a high flow nasal cannula, even you can use the routine nasal cannula. This is what I meant when I said put a 6 liters of flow. On top of it, you put your mask and you are ventilating the patient nicely with your normal whatever flows you have kept. Here you have given propofol, then you have given your sucks as Lakshmi said, and then you increase the flow rate to 15 liters on the nasal cannula, but your other mask thing is going on at the routine rate. And now you, what to answer the question what Anil just now asked me, how do I ventilate that? When I'm doing my pre-oxygenation on my machine, I will add a CPAP of 10. So here is a patient who's in a ramped up position. He's got a nasal cannula going with 6 liters. There is another mask, which is the normal circuit mask, the Randall Baker or whichever we are using. That is going with 6 liters. Nicely pre-oxygenated patient with a CPAP of 10. Then you give your propofol, succinylcholine. Then you start ventilating. This is the normal sequence of how we ventilate, pre-oxygenate, ventilate, and then intubate. That is the normal sequence.
one more thing is that please don't add fentanyl or any other sedation before you started the thing. You add all these sedative in case you are using any morphine or any other sedatives. Add it later on, not before. The patient will desaturate immediately if you just put in any fentanyl or any
Now,
other
many of
narcotics.
you now.
We
many
are
of
not
you-
using narcotics mostly, but in case you're using narcotics, please don't use it before. And that also is one
Now,
thing.
many of you will wonder why the CPAP of 10 has been added right at the time of pre-oxygenation. Now, believe me, whether you are doing a non-bariatric or a bariatric, the moment you are giving general anesthesia and you start ventilating or pre-oxygenating with 100% oxygen, humans are not used to 100% of oxygen. We are used to 20% of oxygen. The moment you start inhaling, there is bound to be an atelectasis. In each and every patient, there will be an atelectasis. Extremely so in obese patients because of they have fat everywhere. The FRCs are reduced. They have restrictive lung disease. On all these things, the moment you start 100% oxygen, your patient is going to have basal atelectasis. And if you don't take care of this basal atelectasis, right from the beginning of your pre-oxygenation, it will be very difficult for you all to get those alveoli back into the circulation. No amount of PEEP is going to help you. PEEP doesn't open the alveoli which are lost to the circulation. Only the recruitment maneuver
Recruitment, I was just about
in the thing. So you start your open lung strategy right from the pre-oxygenation, give them the CPAP, put in your endotracheal tube, start ventilating the patient with 0.4 FiO2, 0.4, 0.5 or 6 to 8 ml of oxygen per kg of your body weight.
Tidal volume.
Tidal volume, respiratory rate to manage your 35 to 40, 42 of your end-tidal carbon dioxide, and then recruitment maneuvers are the most important thing. You're giving lung protective ventilation. If you have heard 2-3 seminars which we did, then you must have understood that yes, today what we advocate in obese patients is, for that matter, any patient, is a lung protective ventilation. What do we mean by lung protective ventilation? That the lower tidal volume, 6 to 8 ml per predicted body weight or ideal body weight, but never total body weight. Then recruitment maneuvers, PEEP of 10. These are the things which will help you all along, and FiO2 of about 0.4 to 0.6, which manages your atelectasis. Also, every half an hour you have to do a recruitment maneuver, either by taking the bag in your hand and taking the pressures to 55 and allowing it to happen for 7 seconds, or you can do it on ventilator or you can do it at incremental PEEP kind of method. There are various methods that have been made, very nicely described in any of the standard textbooks. Go through it and you will never miss it. But this has to be done. If you don't do it, then the alveoli will be lost, and then the ETSU2 starts go up and the hypoxia sets in. So if you want to know, this is how I ventilate.
Thanks, sir. So, so let's go into DES or CIVO, because we are having private practitioners, we are having institutional practitioners, we are having practitioners of various categories. So, DES or CIVO, why is the question, sir?
Okay. Now see, if you have DES, please go for it. If you ask me what is my choice, yes, I do cases.
Any specific advantage did you find, sir?
Yes, I have used, I am sure all of us have progressed from ether trilene now to sevoflurane and desflurane. We are the lucky generation. We have seen the entire progression from ether to trilene to halothane, sevo, iso, des, whatever. And yes, des doesn't get absorbed, so because of that, it comes out of the body fast. All the advantages are there. The recovery, you can see it for yourself that it is, the patient is absolutely awake. The whole idea of ours is to get a clear-headed patient with intact reflexes immediately after the operation. That is what your aim is in obesity surgery, or whether you're doing whatever anesthesia, bariatric or non-bariatric. Your patient has to be absolutely awake with clear head and good reflexes. That
Dr. Namrata, at your center, is it DES or CIVO, and why? Hello, Dr. Namrata?
You
Hello?
mic is muted, huh?
Sorry. It is desflurane basically, because the wake up time is so less and the patient absolutely comes out clear headed. So it is desflurane in our
Madam,
center.
at your center?
Acha, in our center, we are practicing two things. One is that mostly we are going for total intravenous anesthesia. But when it comes to inhalational, then we have found that if we are monitoring the BIS, then CIVO and DES probably do not have too much of difference. So that is what me and Lakshmi will also agree to this probably. That we are finding it very comparable, provided you are maintaining the same BIS for both.
Yeah, I don't use
all about the
this, so I don't have these. Yeah, exactly.
If you
I don't
maintain
have
the,
Any advantage
we use
of,
both. We use both with equal.
any advantage of TIVA over gases?
Aparna.
Yeah, please,
No,
madam.
TIVA, we are following very green OT concept. So I stick to total intravenous anesthesia for 100% of my patients. But yes, I have no aversion to.
Cost versus clinical benefit to the patient.
No, it is very comparable. It is very comparable. I don't
Anil, I think
you know,
the cost in bariatric patient actually doesn't matter. It is basically patient safety and wake up. Does cost actually matter in these kind of patients who are going for bariatric? We haven't had
That was a question because
Cost
our
is very
audience,
comparable.
like they need to know this.
I think the audience also should be given a clear message that in obesity patients, basically the cost should not be a factor at all. The audience should also be given this clear message that in bariatric patients or even for any obese patient, I don't think cost should come into it at all. It has to be patient safety all the way.
Right, madam.
So I think Dr. Sai wants to ask me about TIVA technique. So if Anil will give me 2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes. Yeah, you can
We will
start.
come later.
So one more thing I wanted to
Because I had one more controversy here, because most of our anesthetists like want to know whether nitrous is to be used or avoided. So
Avoided. Not used at all.
Avoid.
Not
Avoided
used at all.
total.
So
Shouldn't be
Dr.
used at
Hemant is
all.
having another view. Is it so?
No. See, personally, if you ask me, I don't use it at all. But
Right.
there are people who have used it and they have found it useful. So my take on this is my personal choice. I use air with oxygen. But
Right.
if somebody is using nitrous, if they like the extra additional
The surgeon will object the most, I think, if
Like,
you use
I think
nitrous.
the surgeon
The
doesn't
surgeon
mind.
It depends on the type. It depends on the type of surgery as well. If you are doing a sleeve gastrectomy, probably you can use a nitrous. It doesn't
Correct.
dilate the gut and all that. If you are
Correct.
doing the gastric bypass, you must not use the nitrous. That is the
Right, right. Because in
So
my
one thing
center,
Dr.
I
Anil
do use
to
for
add-
sleeve. I do
I
use
think
for
Dr.
sleeve
Lakshmi is saying something.
So one thing I wanted to say, suppose somebody doesn't have desflurane, it doesn't mean that he's not going to be. I mean, with CO, it's going to be a long, delayed recovery and all. We must be very clear that desflurane has a blood gas solubility of 0.42 and CO has 0.6. So it is not at all, very
Not
different.
radically different.
They're not very difficult. They're not radically
And
different.
yeah, actually get
Emergency agitation which we find is more with desflurane. Maybe it is our experience, whereas with SIVO we find it very smooth. Number
Yeah,
three,
exactly.
patients with secretions or little, airway collapse and all, sevoflurane acts as a very good bronchodilator. So we find that sevoflurane is advantages that
And hemodynamically also it is better. Hemodynamically also SIVO is better.
I fully concur with this thing. In my setup, personally, I am using nitrous also for sleeve, and I am using SIVO. And SIVO has a better recovery profile, as rightly pointed out by Madam, that the agitation part
Yes,
is very, very
yes,
less. So
yes,
in
yes.
recovery, you have a patient who is listening to you, who follows your command. That is my experience of it. So I was waiting for this, whether someone points this out, because in my experience, SIVO has definitely, at least on this part, scores much
Advantage.
better
It
than,
has advantage over DES.
yes.
I've used both,
Yeah.
actually
The
used
one
both,
point
but
I want to make is
don't
between
have any.
Sevo and desflurane is like for a low risk patient, like 40 BMI, young patient without comorbidities, you can very well use, or unanticipated difficult airway or extubation difficulty, you can very well use sevoflurane in place of desflurane. While in those patients who are very high BMI, very high cardiac risk, low ejection fraction, or hemodynamically labile patient, you can use desflurane as a preferred method of inhalation agent. So it is an individual patient-based choice also. We can
Even the restlessness is, I think, more individualistic
More with
to the
DES.
patient. No, it is individualistic to the patient. I have seen it with DES and SIVO both. So it depends
be.
on the patient on how restless they are or what the patient. It is individual to the patient. I don't think it's much to do with SIVO or
So
DES.
they're very comparable. Both the
Okay,
inhalation
coming to
agents are
coming to
very-
one more thing that is important, I feel here is about the relaxant, right? Because everybody is worried about too much relaxant or too less relaxant. I was interacting with Dr. Rutles, like who is doing mini gastric bypass. He had come for a workshop, and he said, "You won't believe he is doing all his lab on a spontaneously breathing patient." While that is one extreme, what I want to know from you is like, what is the doses? Is there a specific doses for the obese patient? How do you titrate your doses of muscle relaxant? Because this is what most anesthetists fear, that at the end of the surgery there should be a clear recovery or absolute recovery. So what is the doses of muscle relaxant, Dr. Aparna, if you can come in for that?
Yeah, so we are using either mostly atracurium most of the times. We are very fond of this. So we are using loading dose and infusion both, and we are basing our dosage on the ideal body weight. So in our experience, and I think Lakshmi will agree with me, that if you stick to the ideal body weight, then we have not had occasions where our patient has had any instance of delayed recovery because of muscle relaxant. Because even after the closure, even if at that time I switch off my muscle relaxant, dressing, repositioning the patient, all that gives us sufficient time for the patient to come out of infusion. So we have not had any problem. So I think we should stick to the ideal body weight. for
Infusion also helps. I think
Yes, yes.
it is that
such good condition to the surgeon to operate, and yes,
absolutely.
Yeah.
That you give a bolus dose and then continue with the
And
ideal
followed by
body weight
infusion.
on
Yes.
infusion. Right.
yes.
Yeah, may I add on basis of my experience, if the purist, they might disagree. What I have seen is if the total body weight of the patient is around 150 kg and less, I titrate it to 70 to 80 kg as the doses for the muscle relaxant. If the total body weight is more than 180 and around 200, 210, what I have seen is if I titrate it to a 90 kg approximately weight, it helps. This is just by experience that I am saying. What you have rightly pointed out, that it should be based on ideal body weight, but this is again for the practitioners, that if they have difficulty in titrating, they can roughly take it as a guide, like, okay, I treat the patient as this much for giving the dose of the muscle relaxant. That is what is my experience.
Absolutely.
Right. So, Dr. Hemant sir, what are your ventilation strategies intra-op? Can you throw some light on that?
Yeah, because like I mentioned initially, that low flow techniques is good. Then your lung protective ventilation is good. About 6 to 8.
More or less covered it.
Yeah, I've covered it. No, but somebody wants me to say how
Yeah,
do
actually, that's what I saw that. That is the questions are there.
So
Yes.
let's then discuss on that, because that I didn't cover probably. Recruitment maneuvers, like I said, are mandatory. Now there are two ways you can do it. One is obviously you can take the bag in your hand, put the knob onto the manual ventilation, set the pressures to 55 and press the bag for 7 seconds by the watch. This is a manual method kind of doing it. What it does is 7 seconds the lung remain inflated, or that pressure, whatever alveoli are getting ventilated and not will get opened, and you will recruit the lung which has been lost to the atelectasis. This is just one method of doing it manually. Now there is another method you can do it directly onto the ventilator. And now how do you do it? It's a very simple method, I would say. If you have pressure support ventilation, choose the pressure support ventilation. Take the pressure, ventilatory pressure to around 40, set it at around 40. And now you can start your whatever ventilation is going on. Now you decide to do the recruitment maneuver. Okay. So now you've added, I told you my PEEP is already 10 that is going on. So now what you can do is now start to ventilate 1 minute with this kind of thing. That is, you are giving 20 pressures and 10 PEEP. Then you gradually make 15 PEEP, 25 pressures, 20 PEEP, and automatically the ventilator will set its 1 minute. You keep on ventilating like this, and it will bring your all the alveoli back to the earth. There is another method you can do it, and that is reduce the respiratory rate to 4. Okay, you have reduced the respiratory rate to 4. So what is going to happen? Your entire inspiratory, expiratory, the whole respiratory cycle is going to last for 15 seconds. If you keep your I ratio is to 1:1, then automatically the patient will get ventilated. Inspiratory movement, what you are achieving with your bag for 7 seconds, this will happen exactly with the ventilator for 7 seconds. So that is another method you can do. So the whole idea is don't let the pressures go beyond 40, which will hurt your lung. Time it to 7 seconds by whichever method you want to do it. So this is how you do it. And remember, the moment you stop doing this, don't go back to 0 PEEP and normal ventilation. Keep PEEP again and start ventilating again on the whatever PEEP, say 10 PEEP. So the lungs get distended and then they remain open. So your oxygenation also will remain for a very long time into a good zone, and the lung that has been lost to your atelectasis will be recruited back. So these are the strategies which you can play with. 1 manual, 2 on ventilator, 3 on incremental PEEP kind of stuff. So these are the 3 methods which I use for getting the lung back into recruitment mode.
Right, sir. So
One
I want, yeah,
Mr. Anand,
yeah, ma'am.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Dr. Hemant has very beautifully explained all this. But if actually you go and read the textbooks, they just say 40 centimeters, up to 40.
Yeah.
But here, we must remember this is a morbidly obese patient whose compliance is so low. So already he has a basal airway pressure which is much higher than any other patients. So here, as Dr. Hemant said, we can go up to 55, but only for 7 seconds. Maybe you can repeat the recruitment for say 3 times and then, put him back on the pressure controlled or volume control. It doesn't matter whether you use pressure controlled or volume controlled ventilation. The main thing is recruitment.
Yeah.
Right. So actually, I always feel, and it is for all my anesthetist colleagues who are listening to me. Frankly, if you want to get respect in your OT, you need to know the surgical steps. Always remember this thing. A good surgeon will respect you only if you know what are the steps of the surgery. So mostly, I want to highlight the two things which are very common in the two surgeries which you do for bariatric surgery. One is the sleeve gastrectomy and another is the Roux-en-Y. In sleeve gastrectomy, you insert a GCT tube, right? It's called gastric calibration tube. So we must be very careful while inserting this. All sorts of traumas can happen. You can even have a tracheal perf, right? So you should be very clear what you are inserting and how you are inserting. I will like to point out here that you take a long or large blade of laryngoscope and do a gentle laryngoscopy and do it, and you stop where you face the resistance. This is very important. Just don't insert the whole tube if you are facing resistance. What is a better method of doing it? I again was told to me by a surgeon. If you are encountering a resistance, that means there is some obstruction, right?
Obstruction there.
Don't
So
push.
have a Tommy syringe of
Yeah.
50 cc, right? So through that tube, just put that 50 cc of air, because air is harmless, right? So it will open up the track for you. Or otherwise, wait for the surgeon to put in his laparoscope. Then he will guide your tube, right? So this is one practical point as an anesthetist where you can directly help the surgeon. And if you are doing that, believe me, his trust in you and his respect in you will grow, right? So this is very important. Another thing is doing that leak test that we do, right? This 50 ml methylene blue is put through the tube. So we should be very clear that our saturations will drop, right? Maybe because of the methylene blue interaction. So try to suck it out maximum when you are taking out this tube, right? And any NG tube, some surgeons have this tendency that they will put an NG tube into the GCT tube, right? And then ask you to deflate the stomach so that it is easier for them. So we have to be very careful about these steps. And if it is coming to Roux-en-Y, there is a metallic part called Oroville, which we need to introduce into the pharynx.
Anil, can I just add one thing before you go to the gastric tube which we have? It
Yes,
has a cuff
Yeah.
inflation. You have to basically cut the cuff. I had one patient who would come back again to this thing. It was being operated in some other center. When they were doing the methylene blue test, they put the dye in the cuff instead of
Oh,
putting
yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
in the
Very, very practical
instead of
point.
putting it in the. So what happened was that they had a burst of esophagus because the tube was still in esophagus, and they put in that with the cuff inflated, and that's how it got burst. So basically, when you're putting in the tube, before you put in the tube, just cut the thing because you don't need the cuff anyways. So you just cut the thing away so that there can be no casualty as it is.
Because
No disaster. This is not a casualty, it is a disaster. So there should be
We
no
are
disaster.
discussing these steps because this is directly in the anesthesia domain, right? This is where in this you are directly responsible. So there is this metallic part called Oroville, right? It is attached with the stitches and all that, and with the fiber. So it has to be gently passed through. If you are having problem, do inform your surgeon immediately. Don't feel that, okay, what he will think, I don't know, or something like this. No. Any problem in passing this Oroville, it's very important part, right? So you should always inform the surgeon that you are having problems in that. So this is very
You
important.
must
part.
not go ahead. Must not go ahead if you encounter any resistance. Any resistance, just
So,
stop. Then
Anil, one more thing to add to the surgical techniques is that a lot of times the surgeons feel that there's not enough space, especially in large built patients with large abdomen. So they would tell us to, increase the intra-abdominal pressure to up to 20 millimeter mercury. So many a times we have to do that. So when we are doing that, we should make sure that we should do at a stretch for maybe not more than 10 to 15 minutes. After that, we must deflate it back to 15. And if required, if we see that there drop in saturation at that time, then that should also be followed by recruitment maneuver. So some machines have inbuilt recruitment methods, otherwise we can do it manually.
Especially while stitching, they're doing the anastomosis, they ask many a times.
Yes. So it's not that we have to say no. We cannot say no for, elevating the pressures to 20, but we have to only limit the time. So at a stretch, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. But if a patient is having a baseline nephropathy, in those patients, probably we can tell the surgeon right in the beginning that we will not be able to give higher pressures for those patients, because a lot of patients will have CRF. So in those
that's a great point.
patients, intra-abdominal pressure should not be,
One more thing, Dr. Anil, I wanted to add was when you said, these gastric bypass patients, we must remember, they should be, if you insert a Ryle's tube in the beginning, you must take it out. There's no need to keep the Ryle's tube in, just like other laparotomies and all that we do.
Yeah, we had one, and we've seen all the complications. We've seen a staple of Ryle's tube with in gastric.
In the temperature probe, many a times we put in nasal. So that also should not be used in these patients. And number three, even the long nasopharyngeal airway sometimes has a tendency to slip in when you're pushing the gastric calibration tube, and you will not be even aware of that thing that the nasopharyngeal has slipped in.
I was going to highlight this, that while you are manipulating your GCT tube, always have one hand on your tube.
on your endotracheal tube.
Always have
Especially when you are pulling it out. Especially when you are pulling the GCT out, it can pull the ET tube out.
Yes, absolutely.
So coming to most important part is the tracheal extubation, right? Because it's just like always anesthesia is a simile with the aviation industry. So the touchdown is always as important, I feel. So may I come to Dr. Lakshmi? What are your extubation strategies? Like how do you plan your extubation in such patients, madam?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, one thing again, as Dr. Anil said, this is again yet another very, very important time as far as we are concerned. And when we were students, elective ventilation was a norm. All morbidly obese, straight away shift him on elective ventilation to the ICU. Whereas now with the ERAS protocols and all, things have drastically changed. One more thing commonly we see is, once the surgery is over, everybody seems so relaxed that the senior surgeon and including the senior technicians, anesthetists, all want to go out for a cup of tea, leaving the junior most person there with a junior most technician. Whereas here we must remember, when we were securing the airway, everybody was around, including the surgeon, as Dr. Namrata has pointed out. So whereas here during tracheal extubation, we have to see that the same condition is maintained. That is one thing. In fact, I was just reading the literature, the close claim studies. They say the mortality is almost 5% in extubation failures in morbidly obese patients.
Yes.
And that is pretty high a number. And 13% of the OSA patients do get re-intubation. So we must remember that this is a time we have to be extremely careful. So now what should be the position of the patient before tracheal extubation? Continue the ramp position. Now what will be the FiO2 during extubation? Remember, it is 100% oxygen. Now how many people are required during extubation? The entire team, right? So again, now what are the difficult airway carts to be ready? As Dr. Namrata said, everything would be available with you, including the bougies and the entry catheters, etc. Right? Now nowadays with the COVID era, you require the airway box also with you, when you extubate. Now deep versus awake tracheal extubation. What do you think? So I would definitely prefer an awake tracheal extubation. And no way is deep anesthesia going to be beneficial in these patients, because losing the airway, oh God, we don't even want to think about it, right? Now, so what is the next thing that we have to do? So the next thing is, what are the steps? As Dr. Hemant pointed out, one is pre-oxygenation before tracheal extubation. So that has become an important thing now. That means 100% oxygen should be there. The next thing is, another good alveolar recruitment, definitely with 100% oxygen and PEEP. This is going to be mandatory before tracheal extubation. Now, the third thing is we know that he is a difficult intubation, right? So, what we can do is either use a supraglottic airway device as a conduit, or we can use the airway exchange catheters, or use a long, you always insert a long nasal airway anyway in these patients, so that we can connect it to the oxygenation the moment we extubate. Now, what is Bailey's maneuver? That is, we insert the supraglottic airway device or the second generation supraglottic, whichever you have. When the endotracheal tube is in situ itself, you insert this supraglottic airway. Now, once the reversal is done, of course, it goes without saying that all the conditions of the reversal are met with, like fully reversed, off ratio is more than this, and head lifting is there. Everything, patient is away, and so this is the time when we decide on extubation is somebody gives a positive pressure ventilation when with the valve slightly closed, and you push in the, you take out the endotracheal tube, simultaneously with the other hand you push in the supraglottic airway device and place it in the glottic opening. So in these patients, placement of a supraglottic airway device is not difficult. Now this is the Bailey's maneuver, which we have followed many a times, and remember it is an airway, so we can retain it as long as possible. Even the patient can be shifted to the recovery if you want. Otherwise, you can keep him on the table also till he becomes awake enough to spit out the laryngeal mask airway. The third thing is, if you want to use a airway exchange catheters, we use the Cook's airway exchange catheter. This is almost 55 centimeters long and very narrow, about 4.5 millimeters, so that any size endotracheal tube can be slid in. So we insert it into the endotracheal tube, and remember this has an international connector at the other end, where we can directly connect with the circuit can be connected, so that oxygenation will continue. One thing here you remember is, because it is 55 centimeters long, it's very easy to insert it much longer than what is required. So if you have inserted the endotracheal tube and fixed it at say 22 centimeters, that means this airway exchange catheter also has to be fixed at 22 centimeters and nothing more than that, because that is the ideal position. So once you are ready with the extubation, then this is fixed there, and then you take out the endotracheal tube, disconnect the circuit from the end, again reconnect with the Cook's airway exchange catheter. Again, people say, when do we take it out? You can retain this Cook's airway exchange catheter. In fact, books say even for 2 days. Of course, we are not talking about that. You can leave it in sit till the patient. It's because it's so narrow and just 4.5 millimeters. Patients easily tolerate having this. So this positive pressure before extubation, and this is very important. So now coming to shifting of this patient. So all is done. The patient is nicely come out. But remember, even the shifting position, the trolley, the ramp position has to be maintained. Remember the same weight bearing trolley where the patient is going to rest. That has to be brought inside the OT. We must have an oxygen cylinder attached to the trolley. And what we follow in our institution is, we continue to nebulize the patient en route to the recovery room, so that the moment he lands up in the recovery room, he can be connected back to his BiPAP or CPAP in the recovery. Once we come to the recovery, of course, apart from attaching the other monitors, there is a big stress nowadays on using the capnostream monitor. That is monitoring the CO2 in a patient who is ventilated with a face mask or a nasal catheter or a nasopharyngeal airway. Now, this has basically 4 elements. One is the EtCO2, the other is the SpO2, the pulse rate, the respiratory rate, and all this is integrated into one figure called integrated pulmonary index. Now, in this, if it is 10, that means we are very safe, patient is very safe. So you can easily tell the sister who is monitoring that in case the IPI falls below 7, she must alert us immediately. Otherwise, we have to tell her what is the CO2 goes more than 40, or the CO2 goes low, or the weight is high. It becomes confusing for her. So one simple instruction, watch the IPI. If it is less than 7, then call us immediately. And if it is greater than 5, we must immediately take the intervention. So this is one of the most important things.
So, can I add something, Lakshmi, here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we have shifted a patient in the recovery and we are monitoring, so we definitely have the capno stream, which is telling us about the EtCO2 and SpO2. So at that time, we must revisit what was the baseline SpO2 of the patient. So our management has to ultimately, once the patient is fully awake, be centered around the baseline SpO2 of the patient. So what happens is, like, there have been some published reports also that, saturation of a patient was found less. The nurse was taking a round. She saw, okay, the saturation is less. So she connected oxygen and then she waited for some time. The saturation came back to, let us say, more than 97. And then she walked off. She did not inform the doctor. After 6 hours, the patient's attendant comes and tells that the patient is not responding. So the patient was found dead. So what had happened? Now, this was an obese patient who was otherwise sleep apneic. So only to monitor the oxygen is not this thing. So if we hyper-oxygenate a patient in the post-operative period without even thinking about what must be the EtCO2, we are actually taking away the drive, respiratory drive, which might be coming from a elevated SpO2. So keeping a balance. So in centers where we do not have capno stream, we must actually, be on the lookout. Once the patient is fully awake, it is good to maintain the SpO2 around the baseline. So we don't have to aim for all the time having more than 97, 98, 99. It is not like that. We have to play around the baseline, because after the patient is fully awake, you are tapering down the oxygen. Definitely patient will reach a baseline and will stop over there. So it is extremely important to revisit what was the baseline SpO2 of the patient. Okay, so to maintain that, we use the NIV in the post-op period.
Right, madam. So, Dr. Namrata, what is your post-operative pain management in such patients? What is the strategy? Like, how do you go about it?
Sorry, we give multimodal pain management. We give NSAIDs and paracetamol, and we give, initially we were giving the tap lock on both the sides, but then nowadays we are not giving tap locks. We just infiltrating the ports with whatever, any local anesthesia with the thing, and that is it. But we sometimes in young patients with who are going through this thing and the BMI is not very high, not above 40, we are using narcotics on and off. If the patient is very restless, especially in sleeve gastrectomy, the patient becomes very restless with a sleeve gastrectomy patient. The other patients behave way better. I have seen that. That's my experience. So in those cases, narcotics is necessary for post-op pain. That is it. And monitor the patient well.
Ankit, what are your strategies? Like, do you use narcotics
we use narcotics small doses as and when required. If as Namrata said, that patient is young patient, a sleeve gastrectomy, very restless, low BMI, without many comorbidities, we use definitely a low dose of opioid, mostly fentanyl. We use like 25 mics or 50 mics aliquot. Of course, with due monitoring in the recovery area and not beyond the recovery area. If they are going to be shifted to the room, it's a no in a room. But yes, definitely in recovery area, we use small dose of narcotics along with NSAIDs and intraoperatively port infiltration, port site infiltration. And no tab block for us at any moment.
Any role to all the panelists? Any role of Dexmed in your setup? Have you started using?
100%.
Yes.
All of us use Dexmed.
All of us are using.
100%.
We use Dexmed.
And
One more thing for analgesia. One more thing, we are using, total opioid-free analgesia. We are using ketamine along
Ketamine,
with
yes.
ibuprofen.
I
We are
also
using
give
quite
ketamine.
a lot. So initial induction dose we give, about 0.25 milligrams per kilogram body weight ketamine, and intraoperatively, in case we feel that the patient requires little more analgesia, additional 10 to 20 milligrams we are giving. This works extremely well. Same thing in the recovery room. The moment we shift the patient, maybe if the patient is a little restless or something, just a 10 milligrams ketamine works wonders for the patient. Of course, this is apart from the NSAIDs we are talking about. And also, in few patients, we are also using Maxilf
Yeah.
1 gram intraoperatively. This also greatly helps us in the opioid-free analgesia or minimizing the opioids.
How much Maxalf are you using, Lakshmi?
1 gram. 1 gram.
1 gram.
1 gram.
Yeah.
Right.
Infusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, coming to another important part is weight is equal to immobilization is equal to DVT. So, Ankit, what's your take on DVT prophylaxis? How do you manage such DVT prophylaxis in such patients?
So DVT is a definite risk in obese patient. There have been lots of studies which suggest that as the weight progresses, like 40 BMI to 50 BMI to 60 BMI, the risk of DVT definitely increases by many folds. So we should be thinking of prophylaxis of DVT beforehand, before we start up the surgery. So in pre-operative period, we give like if the patient is well mobile, encourage them to be mobile all the time till the time of the surgery. We start pre-operative fluids. Adequate amount of hydration will prevent the occurrence of DVT, and we start prophylactic low molecular weight heparin at our center at least 1 day prior to the surgery. There are some centers which uses like 3 days prior to the surgery. Low molecular heparin is started if they feel that the patient is having a high risk of DVT. Even in obese patient, we can divide them into high risk and low risk category. Like if the patient is very old, more than 50 years of age, and the surgery is gastric bypass, if a male patient is there with the history of prior DVT, or the surgery is expected to last more than 3 hours. So all those patients are having mild to moderate to severe risk of DVT. So we continue the DVT prophylaxis even after the surgery for almost high risk cases for almost 28 days. But for low risk cases, 3 days to 7 days of prophylaxis after the surgery is considered to be enough. But the main focus is in post-operative period that we encourage the patient to be mobilized very early. Within 6 hours, they are walking. We'll continue the IV fluid and hydration for them. And low molecular weight heparin are seen to be working better than the unfractionated heparin. But the important thing is dosing is not specified. Some people are using 40, some people are using 60. But in higher risk categories of thromboembolism, we use therapeutic level of dosing like 60 milligram BD, which of course carries a high risk of bleeding. So we need to balance the risk of bleeding versus the risk of DVT and use the appropriate doses for them. But definitely some form of prophylaxis they must get, and mechanical with combination of a chemical prophylaxis is the norm at our center.
Right. So coming to another important thing here is the regional anesthesia. So if we see this back, we should not turn our back on the patient, right? So I think this is a very dangerous scenario or very scary sort of scenario when you encounter such patients, say for gynec procedure, for ops procedures. So I would like to know from Dr. Namrata, like what are your strategies when you encounter such patients? Like how do you go about regional anesthesia in an obese patient?
For obstetrics,
Yeah.
regional anesthesia.
Yeah.
See, this patient you put in an extreme. Usually we don't get this extreme BMI. But yeah, for obese patient with obstetrics, regional anesthesia is the first choice. It's the safest choice. Yeah, this is more like it. This is what we get usually, obese patients. But even in the previous one, you can actually see the midline. So the fat is the minimum in the midline. So you can ask the patient when they're sitting, like this patient is doing, that is what I usually do. Ask the patient when they're sitting that which is their midline. They will point out the midline. And the second is the next slide, which you can see the fold. You first get the midline of the patient, right? And then get the skin fold. So the first skin fold, you just come till the midline and you will be able to feel something. Of course, if you use ultrasound, it is very easy to see where it is. Like, can you show the ultrasound? It is actually pretty easy when you use ultrasound to see the spines and then go in between. See, you can see actually the spines very clearly demarcated when you're using ultrasound. So if you use the transverse or the longitudinal and you mark the midline, and then it is very easy to see the midline. You have to use some additional, either you use a C-arm or use ultrasound to give epidural block or regional blocks. Anything else?
Yeah, one more thing I would like to add, that you better have long needles available with you, long spinal needles, I mean 12 centimeter or 15 centimeter.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you
And
not
yeah, right, and even for post-op pains in OBS patient like the previous one, they have such a huge panelus. You need somebody to lift up the panelus in case you want to give tap lock. That's again a huge problem when you want to give the tap lock. And tap lock does help in pain relief in these kind of patients, especially in OBS patient. So ultrasound and removing the panelus, shifting the patient to one side, at least left lateral tilt or the right lateral tilt, that moves the panelus to one side, and then you can give the tap lock. So that also helps.
So I think it's time to conclude, because it's already getting obese. The discussion itself is getting morbidly obese, I feel. So
Not morbidly, only obese, not morbidly.
okay, I'll leave it to that. So the basic gist of the things, and thank you panelists, the main thing that comes out is that you have to optimize your patient for the best outcomes by using your skills, by knowing the limitations of your setup. So this is the take home message, that if your preparations are well, your end result will be good. So I hope that we are able to give some insight, that is maybe SOME some or SUM some, depends on the audience, into the how to manage an obese patient. So thanks once again all the panelists. It was a wonderful discussion, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Anil, for the initiative and for having us here on Saturday evening. And I hope, we have managed to answer some of the questions. Otherwise, they can directly put it on the group and we will answer.
Yeah.
Plus,
There are
I think this
questions that
will be
are
put on
unanswered.
YouTube also. We can answer it when they put it on
We
the
can
YouTube.
answer. They can tag us and we can answer the questions. I think
Yeah.
Sai wanted to know.
This
Yeah,
is a huge topic to be covered in 1 hour.
Because we'll have to have another
The
session.
topic is as big as the patient itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a huge topic, and we've not covered like even half of what
We haven't covered.
the
But
complications haven't been covered.
we have safely shifted our patient, so I think that let's call it a day.
Yeah, thanks, Anand. Thanks for having us here.
I think it has to stay in HDU.
Thank you. ma'am.
Thank you,
The
everybody.
patient has to stay in HDU.
Yes.
Thank you.
HDU में
Thank
रखना
you.
है.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you,
Good night.
everybody.